Thank you, Denise. Thank you, musicians. I wish I had you with me every Sunday.
That can be arranged.
I don't get that kind of music in the Episcopal Church very often. You know, if the Jews are God's chosen people, the Episcopalians are God's frozen people. That's part of the reason that I enjoy my relationship with Unity so much. I suppose I've spoken in at least 50 Unity churches throughout this country and indeed throughout the world. I resonate with your message. I admire your clergy. And I see the Unity movement as a strong ally in what I call the battle for the soul of Christianity. So I am particularly grateful to be in your presence. I've been here before. I spoke in this church, in this building, on the first Tuesday in November in the year 2000. I remember it because as we walked in, the networks had called Florida for Gore and gave him the election. As we walked out, they reversed themselves and called Florida for Bush and gave him the election. So I've always held this congregation responsible for the election of President Bush. So I have many, many happy memories. I want to talk today about this book. I found it in the senior minister's study. It's called the Holy Bible. It was hard to locate. There was only one copy of it around. On the shelf, it was right next to Peter Gomes' book on the Bible called The Good Book, but I skipped past Peter's book and got the better book, the New Testament, the whole Bible. Let me say a few words about this book. The earliest part of this book was written about 1000 BCE. The last part of this book was written about 140 of this common era. All of this book is between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. It has concepts that you and I do not believe. We do not believe the earth is the center of the universe. We do not believe that slaves should obey their masters. We do not believe that wives should obey their husbands. At least my wife doesn't believe that. We don't believe that epilepsy is caused by demon possession. We have a very different consciousness about a large number of items, and somehow this book constantly gets quoted through the ages in defense of attitudes that are no longer present. Perhaps we don't know how to read this book. Let me show you something about this book. If you can see it, and I'm not sure you can. Look at the layout of the print. It's in 2 columns on each page. You ever notice that? Do you know any other books that are written in columns? Encyclopedias, dictionaries, telephone directories. But nobody's encouraged to read those things. You go to those things as resources looking for answers. So part of the propaganda around this book through the ages is that it's the answer book. If you can quote it on your side, you win the argument. It's a strange way to relate to this text. Let me tell you one other thing about this text. The Holy Bible is a Jewish book. A Jewish book. There's 66 books in the Bible. All of them are written by Jews. There's only debate about one of those authors, and that's the author of the Gospel of Luke, and consensus scholarship today suggests that he was born a Gentile, converted to Judaism, and then came into Christianity through the synagogue. If that's accurate, and I believe it is, then all of the authors of all of the books in the Bible are Jewish by birth except one, and he is Jewish by conversion. This book was written to Jewish people by Jewish people. They made assumptions when they wrote it that they knew their audience would understand. They have references to the Hebrew Scriptures in the Gospels without explaining where they come from. They mention characters that are important in Jewish history without identifying them. They use practices present in the synagogues that everybody would understand, but they never explained them. Because when Jewish people are writing for a Jewish audience, they assume a common culture, a common scripture, a common worship practice, a common background, and common understandings. This Bible was born as a Jewish book. But something happened in early Christianity. By 150 of this common era, there was hardly a Jew left in the Christian church. The only people that read the Bible, the only people that interpreted the Bible, the only people that wrote commentaries on the Bible were Gentiles. And they were abysmally ignorant of Jewish culture, Jewish scripture, Jewish background, Jewish understandings. It would be like somebody taking a book written by an American for Americans, assuming American attitudes, and let Egyptians be the only ones that interpret it. So Gentiles interpreting Jewish scriptures inevitably decided that the only way to read this book was literally. They didn't understand that the Jews were storytellers. They didn't understand that where you and I might tell a story which we would introduce by saying once upon a time and end up saying and they lived happily ever after, and our audience would know that that was a story. The Jews didn't know how to do that. So they used wild exaggeration to tell their audience that this is a story. That's where you get Jonah and the great fish. That's where you get a tower so tall that it reaches into the heavens. That's where you get the story of the Red Sea splitting and all the Jewish people walking across the Red Sea, and they did it in 20-minute miles. Pregnant women, little children, elderly people on canes and walkers. They did it in 20 miles. Every Jew would have recognized that as an exaggerated story. The only way you can read the Bible properly is to develop Jewish eyes. Look at its words through Jewish lenses. Place yourself into a Jewish worldview. And that's the only way you can escape biblical literalism. 5 years ago, I began a study of the most Jewish book in the entire New Testament. It's the gospel we call Matthew. The author of Matthew was not Levi Matthew, the tax collector. That's a bit of second century pious nonsense. The author of the Gospel of Matthew was a Jewish scribe, familiar with Jewish scriptures and head of a synagogue. And his synagogue was made up of Jewish followers of Jesus. And he wrote from this perspective. Now, there are 28 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew. And if I went through all 28, we'd be here past the time that my plane will take off to get me back to New Jersey. And besides that, people have a way of stopping listening after an hour and a half or so, if I'm lucky. So I want to take one episode out of Matthew's gospel that indicates a different way of looking at this gospel from a Jewish perspective. In the 4 years I spent working on this gospel, I came to radically different conclusions. None of you know about these conclusions because the book I've written on Matthew hasn't come out yet. It'll come out next March the 1st. And it'll come out under the title, Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. Studies in the Gospel of Matthew. Let me take one character out of this gospel that you're all quite familiar with, because this character doesn't stay on the pages of the gospel. This character comes out and invades our culture once a year. Shows up in storefront windows, shows up in newspapers, shows up in churches. He's that strong, silent type with his hand in his tunic, Napoleon-like, standing behind the kneeling Mary with her eyes cast down in front of the creche in which the baby Jesus is asleep. We all know this picture. If anybody showed this picture to you with no description, you would know one is Joseph, one is Mary, one is the Christ child. No question about that. But do we know anything about Joseph? Well, let me give you some facts. Joseph does not, the father of Jesus, the earthly father of Jesus, Joseph does not appear in any written Christian record from any source in any gospel until Matthew writes in the middle of the 9th decade. That's the first time we ever hear of Joseph. Some 55 years after the death of Jesus, perhaps 85 years after the birth of Jesus, Joseph makes his first appearance in any Christian writing. Does that surprise you? Does that suggest to you that maybe we ought not to look at the Joseph story literally? So Paul didn't know anything about Joseph. Mark, who wrote before Matthew, didn't know anything about Joseph. Paul and Mark knew nothing about the miraculous birth story. The miraculous birth story is introduced into the Christian faith about the year 85 in the writings of Matthew, and Joseph is one of the characters in that narrative. That's the first fact. Second fact is that Joseph disappears from the New Testament as soon as the birth story is over. He doesn't appear again anywhere. He's only a character in the birth narrative. Now, when I was a little kid going to Sunday school in Charlotte, North Carolina, at a rather evangelical Episcopal church, I was a precocious little kid, and I said, "What happened to Joseph?" And they suggested that he probably died when Jesus was just a child. Now, that seemed to be a pretty satisfactory answer. It was particularly satisfactory when you looked at every bit of art in the Christian world and you discover that Joseph is always portrayed as an old man. The Virgin Mary is a very young woman, perhaps a teenager. But Joseph is always portrayed as an elderly man. So I said to myself, well, where does that come from? There's nothing in the Bible that says Joseph is a lot older. So I began to search. And I found a 2nd century document called the Proto-Gospel of James, written somewhere around the year 150, clearly legendary. But this gospel purports to tell the world how Mary was prepared from her birth to be the mother of the Christ child. This gospel says that this little girl, designated by God for this holy purpose, was raised by holy women so that her life would always be chaste and pure and holy. But when she got to be about 12 or 13, the age of puberty, Jewish tradition required that every pubescent girl had to have a male protector. This protector could be one of two kinds of people. He could be her father, or he could be her husband. But that's the only kind of male protector that a vulnerable pubescent girl could have, and everybody had to have one. There was no tradition anywhere that Mary had a father. And so these holy women had the task of trying to find a proper husband for Mary. But the primary prerequisite of this husband was that he had to guard Mary's virginity. Now, that cut down on the number of people who wanted to apply for that position. And so, according to this story, 2nd century book, according to this story, these holy women decided that they would only look among elderly men who were already perhaps widowed, whose children were already grown, who had no interest in having more children. They were so old they had no interest in sex. Now, I don't know how old that is. But that's really old. And so this gospel goes through the test that they put the prospective candidates to, and through a series of miracles, including his cane sprouted and grew lilies, Joseph was chosen. He was an older man. His role in the drama was to guard and protect the virginity of Mary so that she could be the bearer of the Christ child. So when I was told as a child that he must have died, it made sense because he was such an older man. His actuarial chart had run out. And so I grew up fairly comfortable with that idea. But as I began to get into Matthew's gospel more deeply, I came up with another alternative. Suppose there never was a Joseph. Suppose Joseph was a literary character invented by Matthew, who introduced him, in order to fill out the cast of characters in his virgin birth narrative, which nobody had ever spoken of before. So I began to play with that idea. Now, you all are not required to agree with me on anything. So be as suspicious of that as you wish, but hold your suspicions in abeyance until I add some additional data. Let's assume that I'm correct. And then ask yourself, if I were Jewish and I was going to present a literary character who would play the role of protecting and legitimatizing the Christ child, is there any Jewish reason why I might want to name this character Joseph? Why didn't I name him Samuel? Is there anything about Joseph that would have been different and unusual for Jewish people? And so you go back into Jewish history, and you began to discover that there was always a division in the Jewish nation. The Hebrew nation, they were actually called. And the division was between the tribe of Judah and the Joseph tribes of the northern kingdom. And if you read the story in the book of Genesis, this goes all the way back to the time when Joseph was born. If you're familiar with that story, Jacob goes and works for a man named Laban for 7 years in order to get for his bride Laban's daughter named Rachel, whom he loves. And after working for 7 years, they have a big wedding feast, and the bride is veiled. They didn't have electric lights in those days. The great celebration, they go to their home to spend their wedding night, and the next morning, Jacob looks at his wife and discovers it's not Rachel. He's been married to Rachel's older sister. Her name is Leah. And the Bible is not kind to Leah. The Bible says Leah had eyes like a cow. What does that do for you? You can tell it was a descendant of Joseph and Rachel that wrote that story. And so Jacob goes back to Laban and says, "You've given me the wrong wife." And Laban says, "Well, in our society, that's no great problem. I'll just give you my other daughter to be your second wife, but you've got to work 7 more years for her." So in the early history of the Jewish nation, there was this tension because Leah was the mother of Judah and Rachel was the mother of Joseph, and they were always competing. The Joseph tribes, no tribe was ever named Joseph. They didn't really have 12 tribes, you see. You've got to be careful when you read the Bible. One of the tribes were the Levites, and they didn't get any land. They were the liturgical functionaries that served all the people. So they only had 11 tribes. And they compensated for this by giving Joseph 2 tribes for his 2 children. So there was the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh. And Ephraim and Manasseh made up about 90% of the land and about 90% of the population of what came to be the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom, which became known as Judah. So there was enormous tension. And the 2 great patriarchs of Jewish history were Judah in the south, Joseph in the north. The first job of the Messiah in Jewish thinking was to unite the people of Israel into one family. The first job was to bring Judah and Joseph together. If you read Matthew's gospel, the first 17 verses that I call the most boring verses in the Bible, that's the who begat whom verses, you'll find that Jesus is descended from King David, King Solomon, King Rehoboam, and all the way down through the kings of the southern kingdom. That was the tribe of Judah. Jesus was descended from Judah by blood. How are you going to bring in the other part of the Jewish nation? You bring it in by making his earthly father and his protector be named after the patriarch of the northern kingdom. Jews would have understood that. Gentiles would not have had a clue about that. So they would literalize Joseph. Now let me press this. If you've journeyed with me thus far, let me press this just a little bit further. Where would Matthew get the biographical details with which he surrounds his depiction of Joseph in the birth narrative? Well, go home and read it. The only thing we know about the biography of Joseph you'll find in Matthew 1 and 2. It does not appear anywhere else in any book. If you read Matthew 1 and 2, you'll discover 3 things about this Joseph. The first is that he has a father named Jacob. The second thing you will discover is that God never communicates to Joseph except through a dream. It's in a dream that Joseph is told by an angel to take Mary, his wife, for their child is holy. It's in a dream that God tells Joseph he must flee from the wrath of Herod. It's in a dream that God tells Joseph it's okay now to return to his home in Bethlehem because Herod is dead. It's in a dream that Joseph is warned that Herod's son is as bad as Herod, so they've got to get out of Judah and to go up to Galilee. God never communicates to Joseph in Matthew 1 and 2 except in a dream. Third thing you learn about this Joseph in Matthew 1 and 2 is that his role in the drama of salvation was to save the child of promise from death at the hands of King Herod. And how does he save him? He saves him by fleeing down to Egypt. That's all we know about Joseph. Now go to the book of Genesis. Go to chapters 37 through 50, where you have the story of Joseph, the Joseph of the coat of many colors, the Joseph of the son of Jacob by his mother Rachel. And read what the Old Testament tells you biographically about that Joseph. And you will quickly learn 3 things. You'll learn that this Joseph has a father named Jacob. You will learn that Joseph is overwhelmingly identified with dreams. He's always dreaming about his sheath of wheat standing up and his brother's sheaths of wheat bowing down to his sheath in the fields, not designed to make your brothers like you. He becomes an interpreter of dreams. He interprets the dream of the butler of the Pharaoh and the baker of the Pharaoh. And when those dreams come true, he becomes the interpreter of the dreams of the Pharaoh. And he rides into political power in Egypt as the interpreter of dreams. He's called by his brothers the dreamer. The third thing you learn about this Joseph in the book of Genesis is that he had a role in the drama of salvation, and that was to save the people of the covenant from death. And how did he save them? It was death by famine, and he saved them by taking them down into Egypt. Now, do you think that's coincidental? Or are you beginning finally to see that if you develop Jewish eyes and read the Jewish Gospel of Matthew through a Jewish lens, that it would not occur to you to literalize the character of Joseph? You would understand the storytelling technique. And you could take that principle and you could apply it to almost every episode of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, people say, but if you take Joseph away from the Christmas story, the whole Christmas story collapses. Well, maybe you ought to look at the Christmas story for a moment. I mean, how many of you really believe that stars move through the sky so slowly that wise men can keep up with it? How many of you really believe that a star is a divine announcement in the heaven of somebody's birth on earth? How many of you believe that this star is equipped with a GPS system so it gets the wise men to their destination? How many of you believe that wise men are sitting around staring at stars with a ready supply of gold and frankincense and myrrh at hand so they can hop on their camels and follow that star to celebrate the birth of the new King of the Jews? Don't you recognize that as a story? And where do you suppose Matthew got that story? Well, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you would know. Let me take you back for just a second to Isaiah chapter 60. I'm sure that the text immediately pops into all of your minds. But go home and read it. Isaiah 60 says, "Kings shall come to the brightness of God's rising." It says they will come on camels. It says they will come from Sheba. And guess what they're going to bring? They're going to bring gold and frankincense. Now, doesn't that sound just a little bit familiar? Don't you think Jewish readers would understand that? But you all have been raised in Christian Sunday school, so you say, where's the myrrh? 2 out of 3 is not a slam dunk. Well, if you know how to read Isaiah 60 with Jewish eyes, you would know the myrrh is there. Because that text says they come from Sheba. Sheba. The Jewish mind would say, isn't there another story in our past about another royal visitor that went to visit another king of the Jews? And back into the text you go until you get the time when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit King Solomon. Most folks have never read the Bible, but they have seen the movie. Most motion pictures set the cause of biblical scholarship back about 50 years every time you see it. But if you read the Queen of Sheba story, you'll discover that she brought truckloads of spices. That's where the myrrh comes from. The myrrh is about the only spice they knew in the Middle East at that period of time. They didn't know about the East, where they got the spices that you and I now identify as spices. Myrrh was the resin of a bush in the desert. It was sweet smelling. It was sort of Jewish deodorant. They didn't take baths a lot, so they put a lot of myrrh in their clothes to take away their body odors. And the Jews didn't know how to embalm the dead. That was an Egyptian trick. So the Jews would take the deceased body and wrap it in a shroud and put lots of myrrh in it to drown out the odors of death. And the burial would take place quickly after the death. So all of the elements of the wise men's story are in Isaiah 60. And very probably, what you and I read is the Christmas story of the visit of the Magi was originally a Christian sermon preached on this text from Isaiah 60 and applied to the birth of Jesus. And all of a sudden, literalism flees. And you enter into these words of Scripture with brand new eyes, brand new understandings. And the story unfolds in almost miraculous ways. No, Jesus didn't preach the Sermon on the Mount, which occurs only in Matthew's Gospel. That's Matthew's portrayal as Jesus as the new Moses on a new mountain giving a new interpretation of the law. And every Jew would have recognized that. When Matthew tells the story of Jesus feeding the multitude in the wilderness, every Jew would have understood that that was an exaggerated Moses story because Moses fed the starving people of Israel in the wilderness with manna, heavenly bread from on high. When Matthew tells the story of Jesus being transfigured, every Jew would know that at that period of history, the holiday that Jews called dedication, that you and I tend to call Hanukkah, celebrated the return of the light of God to the temple, the return of true worship to the temple. But when Matthew wrote, the temple had been destroyed by the Roman army in the year 70. And Matthew is portraying Jesus as the new temple, the new place where God and human life come together. And so he has the light of God descend not on the temple, but upon Jesus himself. And he's transfigured, whiter than any Clorox on earth could have gotten him. A translucent whiteness portraying the divine and the human coming together. And then you might understand Matthew's story. Matthew was deeply Jewish, and he wanted the world to know that Judaism was the mother of Christianity, that Jesus was born in a Jewish world to Jewish parents, but that the power of this Jesus was there to overcome every boundary, every barrier, every discrimination. And so when he's born, the whole world, the Gentile world, receives the announcement through the light of a star. And that star draws all Gentiles to come and worship the Jewish Jesus. And then Matthew tells you the story of this Jewish Jesus. And then to the end of his story, he places the risen Christ upon a mountain. And the disciples come to him. And Matthew says that the last words spoken by Jesus in the gospel were the words, now that you understand who I am and what I'm about, what the Christ experience is, you've got to go into all the world. You've got to proclaim the gospel which says nobody is outside the love of God. You've got to go beyond the barriers of your security. You've got to go to those people that you have classified as unsaved, unbaptized, uncircumcised, pagan, unclean. And you've got to preach the gospel. There is no one who is outside the boundaries of God's love. There's nothing anyone can ever do, there's nothing anyone can ever be that places them outside the boundaries of God's love. That's what the gospel is all about. It's not go into all the world and convert the heathen. Most conversion activities are hostile. Go to those that you have classified as beneath your human dignity and proclaim to them the love of God. And when you do that, you will know that God is with you always because God is part of who you are. That's what the gospel is about. That's what Matthew is about. That's why those who would literalize the Gospels commit what I call a Gentile heresy, a heresy born in ignorance of things Jewish. Biblical fundamentalism is a Gentile heresy. We need to open the Scriptures with their inclusive power for all the world to see. The gospel says you are loved. There is no barrier that binds the love of God. So take that love and be who you are and go into all the world and let them see what it looks like to see God in human form. I commend to you a study of the Gospel of Matthew. Amen.